Welcome, everybody. I'm Abby Gondek. I'm the Morgenthau Scholar in Residence at the FDR Library and the Roosevelt Institute. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to our first session for our conference. This session is called Non-Governmental Organizations, Rescue and Relief During and Immediately After World War II. This is part of our 2021 conference examining American responses to the Holocaust, hosted by the Roosevelt Institute and the FDR Presidential Library and Museum. This session is being streamed live and recorded, and live sessions can be accessed on the FDR Library's YouTube account. And also the recorded session will be available afterwards. Those who are attending, please type your questions into the Q&A tab, which is to the right of the main screen, so that we can see your questions and address them during the question and answer period after all of the speakers present. And I want to take a moment to review our code of conduct for the conference. So there are three main rules. The first one is that dialogue should be civil, respectful, and focused on Holocaust studies and digital humanities. Personal attacks, profanity, or hate speech will not be tolerated, and violators will be blocked. And third, any links or content that's not directly related to the conference will be removed. And our session today is moderated by Anat Kuttner, and I will let her take it from here.
Hi, and welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be here today from Jerusalem. Before we start, I would like to give a few minutes of introductory, giving a bigger picture of what is the period we're talking about. And when we're considering the help of the NGOs during the Holocaust, we will try to distinguish between phases as well as between geographical areas. One of the characteristics of World War II is that although it was a worldwide event, there are these distinctions between different areas, both within and outside of Europe, in the way we describe the needs and the characteristics of the refugees. In the next 2 minutes, I will try to give a general picture of the refugees' needs and of the responses of the NGOs to their needs. Roughly speaking, one can talk about 4 periods. Pre-war, when the threatening winds started to blow. In Germany, they started in 1933. In Austria with the Anschluss, and in other places with the Nazi invasion. Some had time to prepare and flee. Some did not. In some cases, such as the Soviet occupied Poland, there were only a few days between the Nazi invasion and the community's mass murder. This period is mainly characterized by help in immigration, which involved 2 different types of help. These were help receiving entry visas, as well as in transportation. Usually, without an immigration visa, it was not possible to leave one's country of origin. The need here was for help from the authorities in the destination countries, the United States, South and Central America, and of course, Palestine and the Far East. Once the visa was obtained, refugees faced an additional obstacle, transformation out of the country. NGOs granted assistance through the organization of immigrant ships. There was also an illusion associated with geography, especially during this period. Many Jews from Germany thought that they were safe when they found a home in the Netherlands or in France. Jews from Vienna felt safe when they managed to escape to Budapest. Looking back, we know it was untrue. But at the time, it was impossible to predict the course of the war and what was the best way to act. Those who failed to escape at least tried to send their children out. The Kindertransport was created, assuming the current situation would improve and the children would return, or the parents could join them. The second stage in the absorption of immigrants is the countries which they arrived. The immigrants sometimes fled with a suitcase or two, and sometimes only with the clothes they wore. Some came with money, others came with items that could be sold. Some came to countries that were culturally like the places they left, and others came to a new and fundamentally different world. The difference was sometimes economic, sometimes climatic, and in many cases, the cultural differences were profound. And there, the role of aid organizations was no less necessary. In each place, the organizations operated according to the specific needs of the displaced people. So first, they tried to address the refugees' physical needs, soup kitchens, food packages, and of course, appropriate clothing. At the same time, they attempt to help with absorption, activities for the children who wandered around, employment for adults, local language classes, and sometimes, such as in Portugal, helping to migrate to places where their saga could end. The third period, again, varies from place to place, but it is the period of the war itself and the attempts to help those who remained in Europe under the boot of the Nazi dictatorship. Those struggling to survive needed as much help they could get. The aid workers did what they could, ranging from managing soup kitchens in the ghettos, sending food parcels to concentration camps, and even helping to finance armed resistance, such as in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Here, the work of the organizations was, of course, more complex. Although those who had networks set up pre-war were more equipped to help, they needed to be creative to find ways to maximize aid while keeping aid workers safe. One such example, I had already mentioned the Warsaw Ghetto. The JDC office director there at the time gained access to ready cash by taking loans from members of the Jewish community while promising them that the organization will return the money after the war. And the fourth stage, the most frustrating stage of all, in my opinion, was the post-war stage. Help for displaced persons and survivors, those who went through the inferno, those who fled from it only to find out there was no place they could call, there was no place to which to return. And those who thought they found a new home, yet at the end of the war were uprooted once more. Of course, the aid organizations were active here as well. In some cases, they acted in cooperation with the allies, and in other cases, the activities were under the radar. Humanitarian aid in the DP camps was provided mainly by NGOs, learning the needs of the DPs and the ways to treat them. At the beginning, feeding and dressing them, separating them from their perpetrators, and then helping them find meaning again. At the same time, aid organizations also worked to support the Bricha movement, which helped Jews leave Europe while crossing borders illegally and boarding illegal immigrant ships to Palestine. Although the period division varies depending on geographical areas in Europe and abroad, the ways the organization helped, but we must remember that the different periods are clear, and in each of them, the aid organization faced many problematic situations. In the next few minutes, we will hear about some of just drops in the sea of remarkable help the Jewish people offered to their needy brothers. It represents the help of the American Jews to their overseas brothers during this challenging time. Our first speaker today is Ron Coleman. Ron Coleman is the acting chief of library at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and was previously a reference and research librarian at the museum since 2003. He was a 2016 European Holocaust Research Infrastructure Fellow, ERI, and had presented at numerous international conferences about the museum collections. He was an undergraduate degree in history, literature, and philosophy from West Virginia College, and a master's in library and information science from University of Pittsburgh. Ron's title is Refugee Assistance Case Files, New sources, new approaches, new stories, American Friends Service Committee. One, thank you.
Thank you very much, Anat, for that very useful and very important setting of context around what we will be talking about today. Let me get myself started. So as I mentioned to my fellow attendees, once I'm presenting, I cannot see the screen. So if there is any technical problems, please do let me know. As Anat said, my name is Ron Coleman. I am the acting chief of the library here at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I'm very excited to participate in this conference, which I appreciate that the title of the conference is American Responses to the Holocaust. We tend to think of American response in the singular, and we tend to think of the sources of that subject as being government documents, things like what the FDR Library holds, what the National Archives holds here in Washington, or we think of personal collections, things like the Morgenthau family collection, or the family collections of loved ones who are trying to get their relatives out of Europe to the United States and elsewhere during the war. Today, I'm going to be talking about a third kind of source, what I think is actually a new kind of source, and I'll explain why, that I think sheds light on the ways that Americans, plural, from all walks of life responded to news of Europe before and during World War II. Specifically, I'm talking about case files kept by aid organizations. These are files that were kept by organizations about individuals and families that they tried to assist. In particular, I'm going to be talking about the insights of one aid organization, the American Friends Service Committee, and what the case files can show about what the Friends, the Quakers, did on behalf of refugees before, during, and after the war. But I'm also talking about how these collections are, I'm arguing, is a new kind of source, previously unavailable or unused. My goal today is less to argue about what the AFSC in particular did, or even lay out a particular historical argument, but rather I'm trying to provide a set of guideposts and signposts, pointers for further research into this topic, and what this new type of collection, what directions this new type of collection can take us. In order to understand case files, though, and why they're important, and particularly why I think the American Friends Service Committee case file collection is important, it's important to understand what the AFSC did during the war, who they were, and what kind of work they provided. So this is a little bit of background. This is not a comprehensive history of the AFSC's wartime efforts, but is more of a brief introduction to their work. So the American Friends Service Committee was founded during World War I by the Society of Friends, often called the Quakers, as a way to provide relief to those who were suffering from the devastation of war, and as a way to, quote, put Quaker values into action. Their work continued after that war. In the 1920s and 30s, they had relief centers in Vienna, Berlin, Paris, Moscow, and elsewhere that did a variety of relief actions, most notably the child feeding program in Germany that fed millions of children in the 1920s and early 1930s. And in fact, the goodwill that the Quakers built up through this relief work allowed them to continue operating in Nazi Germany long after other American groups had been forced out. During the war, they established centers in Marseille, in Lisbon, even in North Africa before the United States invasion in 1942. Basically, the Quakers went to where they felt they could provide relief. These offices were largely relief centers, and the Quakers, like all aid groups at this time, really felt a tension between providing relief. Do we help the most number of people with the limited resources we have, or rescue? Do we take the limited resources and try to help specific people? After Kristallnacht, the Quakers decided to do both. They established a refugee division, sometimes called the refugee section, at the end of 1938, beginning of 1939, after Kristallnacht, designed to help specific individuals. And in fact, the case files that I'll be talking about are the files kept on behalf of those individuals by the refugee section in Philadelphia. All told, there are about 20,000 case files in this collection that document assistance to more than 50,000 individuals before, during, and after the war. One important aspect of the Quakers' work is that they coordinated with all other aid organizations pretty much. As you all may know, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of aid organizations, national and local, across the United States. And the AFSC, and many of them specialized in different types of work. In the introduction, you heard different types of relief and rescue that was provided by these aid organizations. Often specific organizations would focus on one type of work, helping with refugees adjusting to life in the United States, helping with the actual transportation, ship tickets. The Quakers are unique and somewhat unique in that they did all of this work. They also coordinated with other aid groups, which is something that can sometimes be surprising to scholars. Often when you look at the administrative records of these aid organizations, you get the impression that aid organizations were often working at cross purposes with limited resources. Sometimes you even see comments like, we would have helped so many more people if this other group had not been in the way. In simple terms, the AFSC got along with all the other aid organizations, including organizations that did not get along with each other. And I can go into more detail on this in the conversation later if you'd like. But these case files give texture to these relationships that may be missing from the administrative records. And it's worth noting that the Quakers, both the American Friends Service Committee and the British Society of Friends, were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their work with refugees in 1947. So the AFSC files represent one organization's work, but one of the main points that I'm hoping to get across today is that the AFSC is just one example, and these case files are one example of this type of work. And I'm arguing that these case files are a new kind of source. And what do I mean by that? Well, first, let me talk about what case files sort of are. As I said with the AFSC, these are files that were kept by agencies working with individuals. Usually it's one file per a family or an individual that an organization was trying to assist. These aid organizations were often staffed and run by social workers, in fact, mostly women, it is worth noting. And the files often read like social worker case files. It is an important distinction that these are not the agency administration records. In the case of the AFSC, the actual administrative records for the Quakers are held in Philadelphia. The case files are held in Washington, here at the museum. In fact, sometimes when I've worked with scholars and said, you should be sure to look at the case files for the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society or for the National Refugee Service or for the Quakers, they'll say, scholars will sometimes say, oh, I've already looked at those. What they may have actually looked at are the administration records, not the case file records. Those administrative records are vital, but they don't provide a full picture of what help was provided to individuals. These case files, I think, fill an important gap between governmental records of the kind that you find at the National Archives and personal collections that we have here at the museum and at other places at Yad Vashem and other places around the world. These case files, especially when taken alongside those other collections, really fill a gap in our understanding of how individuals tried to navigate especially the American immigration policy during World War II. This actually makes sense because during the war era, these agencies actually filled that gap in practice. They were the ones coordinating with individuals trying to help loved ones get to the United States. They were working with government officials in Washington, in France, in Switzerland, in other locations to help identify and fulfill the gaps that were not being filled by other groups. If you're trying to discuss the ramifications of American immigration policy, these files are invaluable. These files also can help tell a more complete story over time. What I mean by that is that if you've ever worked with a personal family collection, you may realize that the family may not have kept everything. They keep the most important documents. They keep the the actual affidavits. They keep the letters confirming an appointment with a government official. In some ways, that's kind of a retention bias or a curation bias, that the things that are considered to be inconsequential get thrown away. In the case of the AFSC, at least, and with the case files, they kept almost everything. These files offer, in some ways, a more complete picture, and a complete picture of how the experience changed over time. Working with these files, looking at the details of individual stories, you really get a sense of how long the process of navigating the American immigration policy took, at a time when most correspondence had to be done via mail and via telegram. And you're aware of how constantly alert to the amount of time it was taking everyone involved in these case files was, as you go through them. One more point, just to say, I mentioned in passing that most of these agencies were staffed and run by women. It is important to note that the subject of American responses to the Holocaust, plural responses, looks much different than the standard narrative when you start paying attention to what the women were doing. And if you're looking for that voice, if you're looking for the perspective of women on this, these case files, these aid organizations are invaluable. One important note about these case files, and why I'm saying that these are new collections, many of these have had access restrictions, some cases for decades. That is understandable. Refugees are by definition vulnerable peoples, and these files often contain personal information. However, those restrictions are starting to expire. In the case of the AFSC collection, the museum received them in 2002 when the source archive that had held them was closing. And we acquired them with the caveat that we could make them available. 20, 30 years ago, no one could access these files pretty much. Now we can start to make them available. But it does take time to do that. Archives are understaffed with lots of competing priorities and pressures, and these collections are often enormous. It can take time to make them fully available. But if you are interested in the work of a particular aid organization, if you're interested in researching the experiences of a specific refugee, maybe a family member, it is worth asking about these files. But be mindful of the amount of work that it can take to make these available. It is important to note about these aid organizations in general is that this is one very understudied aspect of American responses to the Holocaust. There are no books or even detailed articles about some of the major organizations, including the National Refugee Service, which was the largest refugee aid organization in the United States. There's a lot of gap in our understanding, historical understanding of American responses, and these case files can really help to fill them. I'll talk very briefly about these case files. I can understand that it's very difficult to use them. I know from experience, having worked with many of them, it's difficult to dive into them because there are so many of them and the stories they contain are so complex. But there are a couple of possibilities that can happen when you start to look at the metadata of these files as data sets. And I will not be able to go into much detail here. In fact, I'm hoping that, again, I'm piquing people's interest, people who are interested in digital history and humanities by teasing at what may be possible from this. But one of the obvious things that are possible is mapping. Here, for example, is a map of all of the AFSC cases created in Europe between 1938 and 41. This is not what's called a heat map. There's one dot for Vienna on this map, and dots for sort of surrounding towns. In actuality, there were more than 1,200 cases created during this time period, just in the AFSC collection alone, just in Vienna. You can see how, when you compare this map to created later, how the shifting needs of refugees, especially into France. The AFSC had an office in Marseille set up even before refugees fled into southern France in 1940. I'm really interested, especially in France. You can start to see, I realized while mapping, the case file map kind of maps directly to the demarcation line of the free and occupied area, at least up to 1942. Just to hint at something else that is possible, once you start to compare the actual lists of names of these collections, and again, I said that the collections are can be difficult for archives to fully make available, part of what that difficulty is making the names available. This is an incomplete list and an out-of-date list of case files that I've been able to identify at various locations. A few years ago, I realized that we actually have full names lists for some of these collections. And so I started comparing those lists to each other in a very awkward way in Microsoft Excel. And you can start to see how the same names appear in different collections. In some ways, this is actually mapping that network of cooperation that I was talking about earlier. I'm very excited to see where digital humanities scholars could go with this type of approach. And finally, just in the few seconds I have left, I wanted to underscore that one of the most valuable things about working with these types of collections, these case files, is that the stories they contain about individuals remind us of our responsibilities as scholars working with these collections. It is often easy to, when you're working with the Holocaust, we work with numbers, and it's easy sometimes to work with vast numbers of victims, numbers of survivors, numbers of refugees. These case files can be a reminder of the individual, that all of those statistics are individuals. Behind each one of those statistics is a human being with a complex set of needs, a complex story. Sources like these case files show that in many ways, in fact, we have a responsibility to remember that human need, to get all aspects of their story as accurate as possible. And sometimes their stories have an American aspect that can be very difficult to tell. These case files are invaluable tools as we work towards our collective goal of getting their story right and honoring their lives.
Thank you very much, Ron. This is a very, very interesting collection. And maybe we'll have time during the Q&A to hear a little more about it. Our next speaker is Isabel R. Isabel is, I have to say here, a friend and a colleague. We work together for more than 3 years now. She's the manager of academic programs and outreach at the Archives of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or as we call it, JDC. She has a BA in International Relations and an MA in History from the Tufts University, as well as a Master's of International Affairs from Columbia University. She obtained a PhD in International History from the London School of Economics in May 2006. Isabel will talk today about a unique chapter, JDC and the War Refugee Board.
Thank you, Anat, for this warm introduction. I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you today, and hopefully it's going to go smoothly. Okay, there we go. And I hope that you will be able to see some of the documents that I will share. It's a little bit difficult sometimes to know what the audience can see or not. So apologies if some of the documents don't appear that clearly. The aim of my presentation today is to present an overview of JDC's unique partnership with the War Refugee Board, and also to showcase a range of primary sources that we have at JDC about the War Refugee Board, including some of our oral history collection. So really my presentation will be divided into 2 parts, and it will be a very broad overview of the partnership. I cannot, because of time limit, get into any of the details. So I'll start with the partnership. The War Refugee Board the War Refugee Board was a small US governmental agency established by the Roosevelt administration in January 1944 to rescue the remainder of Europe's Jews. The War Refugee Board came at the initiative of the US Treasury Department staff members who had grown increasingly frustrated by the obstructions that the State Department had faced in regard to providing aid to Europe. So Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, Foreign Funds Controller Director John Peel, who is here on the photo, that we have at the archives, General Counsel Randolph Paul convinced President Roosevelt of the need to set up a special agency to oversee refugee relief. And the War Refugee Board was established through executive order of President Roosevelt on January 22nd, 1944. Now, while officially the War Refugee Board was overseen by the Secretaries of State, War, and Treasury, it was really led by Treasury staff, by staff members of the Department of Treasury, and it was led by Executive Director John Peel, who had, because the Treasury staff had been the one who had lobbied for the establishment of the agency. Now, what about how does JDC fit into this? JDC welcomed the news of the establishment of the War Refugee Board, and a few days after the establishment, in fact 2 days after the establishment of the War Refugee Board, JDC Chairman Paul Berwald wrote to President Roosevelt to offer JDC support to the new agency. And here I have to say a word about JDC because some of you might not be that familiar with it. So I would say a word about it during the war. From the beginning of the war until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, JDC had provided relief to the Jews in Axis-occupied Europe, providing medical care, food, money, covering travel expenses, securing visas, etc. After the entry of the US into the war, JDC formally ceased its activities, but continued to channel aid to the Jews of Europe through various channels. JDC was convinced that the most constructive action at the time was collaboration between the government and private agencies. And months before the establishment of the War Refugee Board, Paul Berwald had written to, and I have to change my slide here. Paul Berwald had written to the Undersecretary of State, Sumner Welles, to argue in favor of collaboration between government and private agency to provide assistance to the Jews of Europe. Now, how did the collaboration work? Well, JDC was, first of all, the main funder of the War Refugee Board. It provided the War Refugee Board with $15 million. JDC provided not only funding to the War Refugee Board, it also advised the War Refugee Board on rescue activity. As you can see from this letter, a number of JDC staff, Joe Schwartz, who was responsible of JDC operations in Europe, Sally Mayer, who was based in Switzerland, and Mo Leavitt all served as advisees to the War Refugee Board. And not only did JDC advise the War JDC Board, the two agencies collaborated in operations, and I just want to quickly mention three places where they cooperated together. Three neutral countries. Oh, a bit complicated. I mean, at the beginning, shortly after the establishment of the War Refugee Board, Paul Berwald had written to John Peel, and at the suggestion of John Peel, he had sent almost a roadmap as to where the War Refugee Board should focus its work. And Berwald had suggested focusing the work on the neutral countries where Jews, where a number of Jews were already as refugees and where more could be brought. So the focus of the work was the neutral countries such as Portugal, Spain, Turkey, Switzerland, and I want to quickly mention the cooperation of the three, of the two agencies in Spain, Switzerland, and Turkey. So in Spain, Joe Schwartz was at the time located in Lisbon, cooperated with the War Refugee Board to bring more refugees from France to Spain and from Spain to North Africa. In Turkey, the board representative Ara Hirschman cooperated with JDC to bring refugees from the Balkans, that is Romania and Bulgaria, to Turkey, to Palestine, so via Turkey to Palestine. And here is a photo, two photos I want to show you about refugees who were brought from Romania to Palestine via Turkey. And the third place where there was a collaboration was Switzerland, where Sally Mayer, JDC representative, cooperated with the War Refugee Board representative Roswell McClelland, and in fact they collaborated together into tricking the Nazi elite that they would receive ransom money for the release of Jewish prisoners. And I think the relationship seems to have been pretty warm between the two, because Sally Mayer nicknamed Roswell McClelland Hanukkah. So I think that says a lot. So when the war ended, so did the assignment of the War Refugee Board. The board was dissolved in September 1945, and in the spring of 1946, a few months later, a 300-page report was produced. Copies of the report were given to staff members in the State Department, in the Treasury Department, and to former board staff. Mo Leavitt, who was to serve JDC's executive chairman, is the only private individual who received a copy of the report. So now that I've covered a little bit of the cooperation between the two agencies, let me talk about the what we have in the JDC archives relating to the War Refugee Board. And I will start with our text collection, which people who have used our archives are more familiar with. Within the New York 1945-1954 collection, we have about 5 folders related to the US War Refugee Boards. And these contain correspondence, general report about the War Refugee Board. The activities of Sally Mayer in Switzerland are discussed, and there are reports from Ara Hirschman in Turkey as well. The second text collection that has a number that has primary sources on the War Refugee Board is the Istanbul office collection. The Istanbul office chronicles JDC's work in Istanbul during and after World War II. Within the Istanbul collection, the sub-collection organization also has a file on the War Refugee Board. And that file contains a lot of the correspondence between JDC representative Ruben Resnick and the War Refugee Board representative Ara Hirschman. Here, I don't know how well you can see the document I'm showing, probably not that well, but if you look at the bottom, the memorandum is discussing the transfer of refugees from Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria into and just one other thing I would like to add about our text collection, and I'm going to go, our text collection is accessible online through our finding aid and through our database. If you click on the hyperlink, you will enter our database, and from there you can look inside and see the list of documents as shown on this slide. I see that I don't have that much time left, but I want to speak about our very important oral history collection, which is much less explored by researchers or less well known. JDC Archives has 7 oral history sub-collections, and these are oral histories of mostly former JDC staff. And those oral history collections are very rich in information, including information about JDC Archives. The first oral history collection I want to mention is the Yehuda Bauer interviews. In the Yehuda Bauer interviews, we have the oral history of Roswell McClelland, who I mentioned earlier in my talk. He was War Refugee Board representative in Switzerland, and he gave an interview to Bauer where he discusses the negotiations between Sally Meyer and the Nazi during the war. Also in Bauer collection is the interview of Joe Schwartz, who was responsible for JDC operations in Europe during the war. Joe Schwartz also discusses the War Refugee Board collaboration with JDC. And here, I'm really sorry, I'm almost sure you cannot see what appears, but basically in this excerpt, Joe Schwartz discusses the tensions between the War Refugee Board representative in Lisbon and JDC. So, you know, like any relationship, tensions did emerge, and this is the kind of things you can see in the oral history collection that you don't necessarily see in the documents. One more, well, actually 2 more oral history that I want to talk about are the United Jewish Appeal Oral History Project and the Herbert Katzky Oral History Project. Within those 2 oral history collections, there are interviews by Herb Katzky, whose trajectory is particularly interesting because he worked both for JDC and for the War Refugee Board. He worked for JDC until 1943, at which time he was drafted, and he was placed on detached service as a War Refugee Board representative in Turkey, and later on he worked for the War Refugee Board in Switzerland, and after the war he came back to work for JDC. So his interview is particularly interesting in the sense that he had views of both organization, and here I included excerpts from 2 different interviews. In the first one, he says that, you know, he still had JDC interest at heart, and in the second one he explains the division of labor between JDC in Istanbul and the War Refugee Board in Istanbul, noting that the War Refugee Board was doing the diplomatic negotiation and JDC was footing the bill. Now, those oral history interviews are not accessible online in contrast to the text collection. If you are interested in any of our oral history, you need to contact us and send us a note through this little form that can be found on our website. And one more resource that can be of interest is the topic guide we have about JDC and the US War Refugee Board on our website. It includes a lot of the information I mentioned today, as well as some of the documents. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Oh, okay, can you hear me okay? I have this echo, I'm sorry, just a second. This was telling that exactly 15 minutes went through. Thank you very much for doing this. Our next speaker is Ludwig D. Ludwig D. is a PhD student and George Mosse European Cultural History Fellow at the Department of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He focuses on the history of excuse me. He focuses on the history of modern Europe, transatlantic relations, and Jewish politics. After studying at the University of Leipzig, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He received his MA from the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena in 2020. He was granted, among others, the Matthias Erzberger Prize for research on the Weimar Republic and a Fulbright Fellowship. Ludwig's lecture is Exploring Jewish Post-War Visions During the Holocaust, the Case of the American Jewish Committee.
Thank you very much, Anna. Can you all hear me? Great. So I'm also going to try to share my screen. Okay, let's see how this works. So I hope you can see my presentation now. So I can't see you, but I hope that's okay. So there were like a lot of different ways American Jews reacted to the Holocaust, and in Ron's and Isabel's fantastic presentations, we already learned a little bit about how relief and rescue effort played an immensely important role in this regard. One could also mention diplomatic efforts by Jewish organizations or public forms of protest, for example, demonstration on the street or attempts to boycott German goods in the war. However, there's another phenomenon of American Jewish responses to the Holocaust, which I will focus on and give you like a brief introduction today. My talk today, in the next 15 minutes, pursues two goals. First of all, I want to put your attention to a relatively overlooked phenomenon of American Jewish response to the Holocaust, namely how Jewish organizations engaged in research efforts to envision a Jewish future after the war. And this is a phenomenon I'd like to call post-war planning, like research efforts that were conducted during the war. And I'll focus today on the example of the American Jewish Committee, which as you might know, still exists until today, and was in the 1930s and 40s one of the major protagonists in this regard. In the last half of my presentation, I'd like to put your attention a little bit about the possibilities, but also challenges and digital archives might pose to the research of the phenomenon of Jewish post-war planning. I'd like to begin with giving you a really broad overview of what we are actually talking about if we think about American Jewish post-war planning during the Holocaust. It's quite astonishing that immediately after the beginning of World War II in 1939, people started to think about the time after the war. And if you look at to the United States, you have governmental organizations, you have private institutions like the Council on Foreign Relations, which also exists until today, but also trade unions and industrial organizations who conducted research to envision a world after Hitler's new order in Europe. And it's really astonishing how many organizations existed early in the war. So there's a number that in October 1941, at least 50 organizations were somehow involved in the phenomenon of post-war planning, many of them working directly for the American government. However, from a Jewish perspective, there was a huge problem that Jewish issues were nearly absent in these research endeavors. Consequently, Jewish organizations started their own endeavors to learn to engage in Jewish post-war planning. And one of the central ideas was to look back to what happened in the post-war period after World War I and learn from the mistakes that were made back then. Namely, the failure to prevent a resurgence of anti-Semitism, especially in Eastern Europe, the breakdown of international organizations, like if we think about the League of Nations, and the failure of a functional system of minority protection. By researching the past and current conditions of Jews around the globe, these Jewish organizations thought they could prepare plans for a future peace conference. That was the expectation. Actually, like such a future peace conference never came into play, but that was the hope and the motivation back then during the war. One of there were many topics that needed to be discussed from their perspective. For example, where geographically a Jewish future should take place. Should it be Palestine? Should it be Europe, or some European colonies around the world? Another question was how minorities could be protected. Should it be through minority rights or this new emerging concept of individual human rights that really popped up for the first time during the 1940s? How can anti-Semitism be prevented after the war? And finally, also very important for the reconstruction of Jewish communities, how can their property be restituted? If we look at the early 1940s, we see that nearly all ideological currents of American Jewry were represented in the phenomenon of Jewish post-war planning, reaching from the Socialist Jewish Labor Committee to the religious Orthodox Agudat Israel. So there was like a huge conversation going on between roughly 1940 and 45. And one of the biggest and most important protagonists in this regard was the American Jewish Committee. And I'd like to turn to the AJC now. So who was the AJC? It was founded in 1906 in response to pogroms, anti-Jewish pogroms in Tsarist Russia. And its membership consisted, roughly speaking, of the American Jewish elite, like people who were very well connected with political, like the general elite in politics, economics in the US, most of them living in uptown New York. Their general strategy to ameliorate the situation of Jews around the world was backdoor diplomacy. And this put the AJC in a stark contrast to other Jewish organizations, namely the more Zionist-oriented American Jewish Congress or World Jewish Congress, who were more engaged in public forms of activism. The ideology of the AJC was rooted in Reform Judaism, American patriotism, and liberalism. And most important in respect of Jewish post-war planning, they were pretty much opposed to Zionist ideas of a Jewish future. So their members, there was like a broad range of opinions in the AJC, but most of them actually supported non-Zionist or even anti-Zionist ideas. If we look how the AJC responded to the outbreak of World War II, we see that one day after Hitler's attack in Poland, conversations about the post-war world began to start. And in November 1940, roughly 1 year after the war broke out, the AJC founded its private think tank that was supposed to engage in post-war planning. And its name was Research Institute on Peace and Post-War Problems. This research institute was directed by Max Gottschalk, and you see him here, who was a Belgian Jew, lawyer, and previously active in several diplomatic and relief and rescue efforts in Europe. Its permanent staff members comprise a handful of scholars, most of them with Eastern European backgrounds. But most importantly, they cooperated with many external experts. Many of them were refugees who just made it to the United States from Europe. And two of the most famous collaborators in this regard was Franz Neumann, the famous German Jewish political scientist, and Hersch Lauterpacht, who is basically the father of the modern human rights legislation. Both scholars you see here actually contributed like their most famous works, in case of Franz Neumann, Behemoth, which was the first comprehensive analysis of the Nazis' New Order, and Hersch Lauterpacht, a book on human rights, were works conducted for the AJC during the war to support its post-war planning activities. So what was the goal of the AJC's Research Institute on Peace and Post-War Problems? So in one of its first papers, it states that its goal would be to ascertain, integrate, and publish requisite facts that will promote a better understanding of the Jewish situation and provide a reliable basis for subsequent efforts in the field of reconstruction and rehabilitation. So basically, the idea was to serve and to provide the scholarly basis for the AJC's diplomatic efforts, to provide memoranda and policy proposals the AJC could forward to the FDR government. However, there was also another purpose of Jewish post-war planning of the AJC. As I said before, like most contemporaries really didn't care that much about the situation of European Jewry, and this became a big problem from the perspective of the AJC scholars if it comes to post-war planning. So as they say, many non-Jews are not sufficiently acquainted with the tragic plight of the Jews under the Axis, and consequently do not realize the urgent need of taking steps to eliminate injustices against Jews in the new world after the war. So with compiling these studies, they hope to basically enlighten their non-Jewish and Jewish environment to make them more sensible about the plights of their brethren in Europe. Throughout the war, the scholars of the HCC's Research Institute compiled dozens of studies, and from an historian's perspective, these pose like invaluable sources because they give access to the mindset of contemporaries and how they reflected and analyzed the events in Europe. As you see in the corner, they compiled a so-called study course, which was offered to university students, but also private study groups of Jewish and non-Jewish communities throughout the country to engage with questions of Jewish post-war problems. There were also compilations of certain proposals regarding important questions. And as I mentioned before, more internal memoranda for only for the HAC. And here, for example, you see a memoranda compiled by Franz Neumann, which basically became part of his famous Behemoth. To give you like a brief overview of how diverse the work of the Research Institute was. So their scholars dealt with the engaged in current analysis of the current events in Europe. So what we see here are one of the first analysis of Nazi Europe and the Holocaust. They try to explain these events, the events of Europe, mostly by looking back to history and trying to relate the current events to historical events like anti-Semitism. They studied how different groups in society reacted to the Jewish situations. Here we have a study that was interested, examined the opinion of the international labor movement. And finally, we have a lot of studies who engaged with area studies, basically area studies avant la lettre, to figure out in which places in the world Jews could find a safe haven after the war. Their main demands, to make it briefly, were to fight anti-Semitism, to reconstruct Jewish communities in Europe, to find a new migration system. That was very important for them, actually, and resonates with the debates of recent years. To found a new human rights machinery that should be not only on paper, but guaranteed by actual legal mechanisms. They endorsed the idea of democratic federalism, which is particularly interesting compared to the post-war reality of a re-establishment of sovereign nation states. And finally, they advocated for the restitution of Jewish property, which they deemed especially relevant if it comes to the reconstruction of Jewish communities in Europe. What we can see here are ideas and visions that were partly strongly opposed to visions Zionist, their Zionist organizations, contemporaries pursued. And this brought the HAC's post-war visions actually in stark contrast and even conflict with the efforts of Zionist organizations. And excuse me, here we are. So finally, before I switch to the use of digital archives, why does Jewish post-war planning matters for historians and maybe even for the broader public? I would argue that post-war planning opens up new vistas regarding the Jewish reactions to the Holocaust, and this in several ways. So first of all, as I mentioned before, it's an overlooked form of resistance against Nazism. It's an activism beyond public protest, diplomacy, and relief efforts. At the same time, it shows that how Jews, contemporary Jews, try to take their future in their own hands by anticipating the fate of their communities. It also shows how an early form of knowledge production about the Holocaust and how relatively accessible this knowledge was for contemporaries. If you think about how these pamphlets and books were distributed within the United States. And finally, it also challenges a certain strand of Zionist-oriented scholarship that takes the founding of the state of Israel as a national sovereign nation state as given, while as we see if we look at the HAC's post-war planning, there was a variety of alternative ideas throughout the war. In the last remaining minutes I have, I'd like to briefly discuss the.
I don't have last few minutes. I'm sorry. You should really wrap it up.
Okay, we can do this in the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Our next speaker is, I think you should stop presenting to everyone and then we'll be able to. Okay, our next speaker is Abby Gondek, who we already met at the beginning of this session. She develops blogs, exhibits, databases, and data visualization as a Morgenthau scholar in residence at the Roosevelt Institute, related to three research projects. One, the role of lesser-known figures, especially women, in the Treasury Department and War Refugee Board, letters from the public in support of refugee camps in the US in 1944, and the conflict between Treasury and State regarding rescued Jewish children from France in 1943 and 1944. Dr. Gondek received her PhD in Global and Socio-Cultural Studies and an MA in African Diaspora Studies from Florida International University. She also holds an MA in Women's Studies and an MS in teaching urban adolescents with disabilities. Her title today is The Relationship of the Materials in the FDR Library Morgenthau Holocaust Collections Project to NGOs Providing Relief and Rescue. The title was, I think, almost longer than your speech. Abby, thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I am going to focus today on Peter Bergson's Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe, specifically a letter campaign in support of the emergency refugee shelter at Fort Ontario in Oswego, New York. So I wanted to show you some of the connections between NGOs, specifically this particular NGO, and the resources that we have at the FDR Library, specifically the Morgenthau Diaries and also the War Refugee Board papers. Also, as part of this presentation, I wanted to show you some of the digital humanities projects that I have created based on this research. And one of them is a timeline in a software called Sutori. And so it allows you to create links to different online resources. It's very flexible. It can be used in the classroom. And so I worked with an intern, Eileen Dennis, to create a timeline to show the evolution of the development of the refugee camp at Fort Ontario in Oswego, New York. So Peter Bergson was an activist, and he really helped to, he took action that led to the creation of the War Refugee Board and also the refugee camp that was set up in Oswego, New York. So I wanted to show you some examples of documents that you can find at the FDR Library related to this topic. So this is a letter from Peter Bergson to Henry Morgenthau Jr. from August 1943. It's in the Morgenthau Diaries. And I thought this part here was very meaningful. Peter Bergson says, meanwhile, weeks pass and many more thousands of innocent Jews in Europe uselessly lose their lives, and practically nothing is being done, even in the way of a determined attempt to rescue them. Then I'm also going to show you something from the War Refugee Board papers. This is a memo from Peter Bergson to Josiah Du Bois, who worked at the War Refugee Board and the Treasury Department. This is from February 1944, and it recommends the creation of special rescue centers. And so this has been linked to the development of the refugee camp in Oswego, New York. So it's a little bit hard to read the type, but the first paragraph is saying, Peter Bergson is saying that the creation of special rescue centers in the countries adjacent to Nazi-dominated territories, including Jews from Romania, Bulgaria, and some other countries, could easily be brought to Turkey, and those from France to Spain or Switzerland, from North Italy through France to Spain. So this is a memo that was emphasizing the need to create basically refugee camps, and that this is something that kind of led to the idea of creating a refugee camp in the United States. This is from the War Refugee Board papers, which can be found at the FDR Library. This is a screenshot from the Sutori timeline that I was talking about before. So there's a way to include images of documents, and then also you can include text, links. I also wanted to make sure that you knew where you could find the things that I'm presenting to you today. So this is the main page for the Morgenthau Holocaust Collections Project. The website is fdrlibrary.org/Morgenthau Project. And if you scroll down to digital scholarship on that page, you'll be able to see links to some of the projects that I've been highlighting here. And then this is our Franklin database for the FDR Library. This is where you can find the Morgenthau Diaries, the War Refugee Board records, and also this really amazing collection, curated collection of documents related to the Holocaust and refugees. And you can find this by going to our Franklin database and then searching for selected digitized documents related to the Holocaust. So I wanted to show you kind of more like similar to what Ron was showing before in terms of case study. So I wanted to kind of zoom in on a specific folder, which is letters from the public in support of the idea of having a refugee camp in the United States. And this is going to be coming from folder H, as well as a folder of petitions, which were created by the Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe, which was a Peter Bergson developed committee. So I'm going to be showing you some specific aspects of those folders in a second. This is a map that I created using a digital humanities software called Tableau Public, and from the Excel spreadsheets that I created, databases that I created based on over 3,000 letters from the public in support of a refugee camp in the United States. I was able to create different data visualizations, including this one, which demonstrates that the majority of letters from the public in support of the idea of a refugee camp in the US came from the northeastern United States. And the letter that I'm going to be showing you in a little bit is actually coming from Texas. And it was rare for letters to come from the southern part of the United States. So this is an example of the database that has all the content related to the letters from the public. And I did a search for letters that related to the Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe. I found 71 cases, and then I picked one of them so I could highlight it for you here. So this comes from, as I said, folder H. So the letters are alphabetized by last name of the sender. And this particular letter comes from a woman named Grace Hollowell from Edinburgh, Texas. And I wanted to show you the actual text of her letter. So some of the letters from the public are typed, some of them are handwritten. This one happens to be handwritten. And as Anat was saying when she was introducing me, I'm really interested in the experiences of women and how women impacted the stances taken by the government in relation to rescuing refugees. And so I wanted to highlight this letter from a woman. And when letters are handwritten, I think they're especially powerful because you really get to see the person in the text. So the letter states, while you are already moving heaven and earth to create the refuge for which we here petition you, while it is true that all that is humanly possible to achieve the petitioned objective is being done by you and the respective forms of our petition being repeated, let's see. I have the text down here, so it's easier to read. While it is true that all that is humanly possible to achieve the petitioned objective is being done by you and the respective forms of our petition are being respected by you, still do we petition you that the good work which we know will go on without us may as nobly as irresistibly go on with us. I also have included here a petition that she sent, and the petition has this similar language from it's all from the Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe. And I've highlighted here some of the kind of key terms that are in the petition. So this says, whereas the Nazis, faced with certain defeat, have quickened their campaign of torture against the Jewish people, particularly in the comparatively safe territories of Hungary and the Balkan countries. And whereas the president has made it the official policy of the United States to take all measures within its power to rescue the victims of enemy oppression who are in imminent danger of death. She goes on that it is urgent that action be taken at once to forestall the plan of the Nazis to exterminate all the Jews and other persecuted minorities in Europe. And then this petition emphasizes the need for havens of refuge and for temporary rescue camps within the United States. And uses this term free ports, which is a commonly used term. It was a term created by a journalist named Samuel Grafton. And the idea was that Jews would be able to be kind of in a limbo position, so they could come into the US and come to a refugee camp where they would be staying temporarily, similar to a free port where they weren't entering under typical immigration procedures or quotas. And then the idea was after the war that they would return back to their countries of origin. However, that didn't happen in all cases. Many of the refugees ended up entering the US after the war ended. So the last thing that I wanted to show you was some of the data visualizations that I've created using Tableau Public. in order to see them, I actually I had to switch my view. Okay. There we go. So one of them has to do with what regions the letters came from. So as I was saying before, in this graph, South is represented by the turquoise. So you can see that there were much fewer letters that were coming from the South than were from the Northeast, which is represented by the red in this particular graph. And so Grace Hollowell's letter actually represents a minority within the larger body of letters from the public. And then these charts are showing how it was more common for women to send letters than it was for men. And also the letters that were sent by women were more likely to be from individual women than to be from organizations. And so for the case of Grace Hollowell, who sent this letter from Texas, the fact that she was an individual woman fit within the trends of the overall body of letters from the public in support of a refugee camp in the United States. So that concludes my explanation of some of the resources that we have at the FDR Library. And I welcome any questions that you may have for any of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Abby. It was really, really fascinating. Well, the first question we have here is more of an informative kind, and they ask you, Abby, what year was the letter from Texas written? If you could just answer that, and then we'll try to.
Sure. It was written in 1944. Most of the letters came in 1944, particularly between May and August. Those were kind of, the highest month was June. And that lines up with when there was a media campaign to try to get people to support the idea of having a refugee camp in the US. So that's why it came in then. Her letter actually came in July of 1944. So hers was a little bit after the main kind of bump in letters from the public came in June of 1944.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to raise a question which is more like looking from above a bit. And the question is also related to the digital possibilities, but this is what we're talking about today. And I was thinking about it while Ron was speaking. He spoke about the Quakers, and I know that there is in Yad Ben Tzvi, there's also a collection of the Quakers, as you probably know. And I think that one of the things that we could do, in addition to all those statistics and all those maps that you could dot, is the fact that you could see, for example, take things, you could see it in your home and get documents both from ADC archives and from USHMM and from Yad Vashem and from all kinds of places, and you could get a much wider picture without, without the need of an airplane for this matter. And I wanted to think together, what as researchers and as archive and library workers, if you could talk a bit about the perspective you have on this, I would be really interested. And also if you could, when you speak about your archive, talk a bit what is available online, what is not available online from the things you spoke about. So let's start with Ron.
Sure. Thank you, Anat, for that great question. And thank you to my fellow presenters. This has been really fascinating, really inspiring, actually. So speaking specifically of the AFSC collection, the case files that we have, these are not available digitally and may not be available digitally for some time. And it's not because we don't think that it's a worthwhile collection. It's a matter of limited resources and including time and money and staffing. Our goal at the museum is to make our collections as accessible as possible. That includes accurately describing them, making the names lists of this collection available, for example, making this collection easier to discover and use. This collection is so vast, though. We're dealing with probably 700 boxes of archival material, which for digitization purposes would take several $100,000 to properly digitize. We are in the middle of or we have been for many years undergoing an effort to digitize as many of our personal collections as possible here at the museum. And I'll be presenting this afternoon a little bit about some of our collections and digitizations efforts writ large. But it's again that challenge of making things accessible as possible and trying to make them as get them in conversation with other collections that have been digitized. And you're right, Anat, it is much easier to use these collections from home and to be able to digitize and compare them using tools like what Abby was saying. It will be some time before the AFSC collection, for example, is digitized, but we do have at the museum several hundreds, if not thousands, of collections that have been digitally available, that we do make digitally available from home. And as we'll describe this afternoon, we're working to make even more of those collections available remotely than we can right now.
Thank you. Isabel? You just should unmute yourself.
Anat, I'm not sure exactly what the question was now. I got wrapped up in the answer of Ron, but can you go back to the question?
So I could talk instead. I could start. Well, most of the JDC's archives from this period are scanned. Some of them are open to the public. Some are open only for researchers who get to the archives, right? And yeah.
So our archives, our text collections are available to researchers online. They are open to the public with the exception of the New York collection, 1933, 1944. The two collections I mentioned, the New York collection, 1945, 1954, and the Istanbul collection, let me get the date right, 1937, 1949, I think, are open. They are accessible via our database. They're also accessible via our finding aids. And the oral history collection is not accessible online. There are finding aids for the 7 sub-collections listing the different oral history, and this can be requested by sending a contact us a message via the contact us form on our website. So, so most of our text collections, I mean, the majority, with the exception of the New York collection, 33, 1944, are accessible online. The 33, 44 collection is accessible by visiting us.
And what's amazing is that the New York collections are, as you could understand, in New York. However, the Istanbul collection is in Jerusalem. But the fact that they're physically in 2 parts of the world does not mean that you have to travel to both places, because you have everything from your home, even if your home is in Australia, for the matter. Abby, do you want to answer this too?
Sure. Everything that
I'll do at the end to bring the researcher approach. Okay.
Sure. So the all the things that I showed you today are accessible online. Our War Refugee Board records and the Morgenthau diaries are available if you go to the FDR Library's Franklin database, which I was showing some screenshots of that. So those are available online. And we also have a new interface that we're going to be talking about more on Thursday during this conference. And that enables you to search through the Morgenthau Diaries table of contents in a way that wasn't possible before. So that's super exciting new development. So we hope that you'll tune in on Thursday to learn more about that.
Okay, Ludwig, could you give us also the researcher approach to this, like how it is to work as a researcher, not an archivist on this matter?
Absolutely, that's actually an interesting question. So to make it really brief, there are like tremendous online resources, particularly in the HAC archive, and the FDR library also hosts like many files that touches on the phenomenon of Jewish post-war planning. However, I want to emphasize that there's also like the accessibility of digital archives poses certain challenges. So what I was talking about is on the sub-executive level, right? So it was like a small think tank, not represented in the main minutes of the executive level of the HAC. So if you only use digital archival material, you barely see what's going on behind the scenes. So I think for future research, this is really important. You don't have access to certain ideas. Kind of like discuss debates about how Jews should like react to the events in Europe. So that's basically my takeaway of this research experience, that digital archives are a great resource, but you also have to consider its limitations.
Thank you. Isabel, you wanted to add something? And then
Yes.
Nancy, I saw you wanted to ask something, so I saw you.
I just wanted to add to Ludwig's comment, and I think this is where the oral history collection really adds to it, because this is where people give you a bigger picture and also tell you what they were really thinking at the time. So I think in that sense, oral history are very helpful.
Thank you, Nancy. I will unmute you. See if I can do that. Yes. No.
Wow.
Okay, now we
Can
can
you hear
you.
me? Yeah,
Yeah.
I guess this question is for Abby. I was interested in the research you said you were doing on women's responses. And I was wondering if part of that research would involve actually going to some of those families. In other words, the family of Grace Hollowell, for example, and finding out a little more information about why she wrote that letter, and was it in response to the media campaign, or was it something else? Was she a Jewish person? I'm wondering if those are some of the questions you're looking at.
Wow, Nancy, thank you so much for that question. I think it's a really important thing to think about. And that was definitely something that I would love to pursue in further research. I haven't done that yet, but I think whenever you look at very specific kind of micro level individual people's lives, those are the type of things that you become interested in, right? Especially because so few of the letters came from Texas. So the fact that, she's writing from Texas, like that's super interesting. And I will say that for my, not for this particular project, but for other projects that I've done at the library, I've looked at the roles of female secretaries and their influence on the decisions made by the FDR administration. So I've done research about, we don't have very much time left, but Henrietta Klotz, who was the secretary to Henry Morgenthau Jr. And so if you're interested, you can, if you do a search for FDR Library Henrietta Klotz, you'll be able to find more information about that. And I think we are pretty much out of time. So what I'm going to do now is let you know about, actually, Anat, is there anything that you want to say before I? Okay.
I just wanted to thank everyone for wonderful lectures, and thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. And Abby, you get the stage again.
So I just wanted to let you all know what's coming up for the rest of today. And so to do that, I'm going to share my screen with you all. Okay, so we really hope that you'll join us every day at lunchtime from 12 to 12:30. We're going to be having a networking lunch, and the way that will work is you can join and then you'll be matched with a series of people for 5-minute, very brief discussions. And so you'll get to meet potentially 6 different people depending on how many people join the networking sessions. and that's happening every day. You can find this by going to your lobby and then going to the agenda. And then this afternoon, we hope you'll join for one of these 2 sessions. We have Ron's actually speaking on the panel called American Responses, USHMM Resources, and JDC Archives. And we have some great panelists from the USHMM and also JDC who are going to be talking about their resources that they have available for researchers and members of the public. And then we also have on our main stage a session called Myths and Realities of American Responses to the Holocaust. And that is featuring Richard Brightman, Becky Belding, and Meredith Hinley, who are going to be talking about Kristallnacht, The Last Boat, and also Casablanca. And then this evening, we would love it if you joined us for a film screening of Soul Witness, which was created by Harvey Bravman. There's also going to be a Q&A afterwards. And let's see, I think that was everything that I wanted to talk about. And thank you so much for attending this first session of the conference. And we hope that you'll join us for subsequent sessions. And just let us know if you have any questions. You can enter them into the Q&A if there's any last questions, and we can answer them we'll type the answers to you. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much.